Welcome to the Aguilar Conversations. I'm Tony Aguilar. While conflicts such as the Israeli Hamas war or the Russian invasion of Ukraine dominate the headlines, violent conflict within nations seem to be increasing throughout the world. From military coups in nations such as Sudan and Niger to drug related gang warfare in Latin America and the Caribbean. Two of these nations, Haiti and Ecuador, are experiencing tremendous internal violence as a result of these drug wars, which has claimed thousands of innocent lives and has placed tremendous pressure on the government. What has led to the increase of these violent internal conflicts, and what can governments do to restore order? That issue next. Joining me today from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project is Sandra Pellegrini, Latin America Regional Specialist, and Tiziano Breda, Associate Analyst Coordinator for Latin America. Sandra, Tiziano, I want to thank you both for joining me here today.
Thanks a lot, Tony. It's a pleasure.
Let me
Thanks for
start with
having us.
you. I want to talk about the work of your organization first and kind of what you all do and what you try to identify for governments of the world. So tell me more about the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project.
Sure. The Armed Conflict and Event Data Location Project is a project that started as out of the academic investigations of Professor Fiona Raleigh collecting political violence in Africa. And then as the organization expanded and increasing needs for data the organization expanded its coverage first to the Middle East and eventually reached global coverage in 2020. What ACLED is collecting is political events occurring across the world. What we understand by political violence are mostly physical violence. So for instance, we would not collect events of threats affecting. And the range of data that we collect could be violence targeting salient political identities, but also other manifestations of violence, such as armed conflicts. What ACLED also collects are informations on demonstrations across the globe. We categorize these informations in different sub-event types, whether the protest was peaceful, whether the protest was violent, whether there was an excessive use of force against protesters, and whether there was any forms of interventions in the protest. So that's in general what ACLED has been collected.
I want to start with two countries because Haiti and Ecuador have been two of the countries that have been in the news lately. And the internal violence that they are presently undergoing is drug related, Haiti and Ecuador. Let's start with Ecuador then. You have a situation now where the president of Ecuador has said that they are in a state of war because of the drug lords who are having their way in the country. In fact, not too long ago, a number of them took over a local TV station. What has driven this increase of these drug gangs and this war in Ecuador? What's at the source of that?
Well, I think it's a mix of two broad sets of factors. Some are endogenous of the country as specifics, and some are exogenous, so to speak. So the external to the country. So let's take a step back. I mean, Ecuador, of course, is sandwiched between the two greatest producers of coca, which are Colombia and Peru. So and has access to ports, has a good infrastructure, has a dollarized economy. So it's always been appealing for criminal organizations dealing with drug trafficking. And in fact, the presence of this kind of organization can be traced back to as far as the 80s, basically. But in previous decades, these traffics were sort of marginal compared to other routes that were preferred in to ship cocaine towards the US and Europe, particularly through the Caribbean, the Colombian coasts, and Venezuela and Central America. And overall, there was a sort of a dominance between the Ecuadorian Colombia border by the Colombian guerrillas of the FARC that somehow put some order, right, in this sort of in deciding what could pass, how much of it, etc. And in the country, in Ecuador, like the first other external actor, so to speak, Mexican cartel in particular, that became the predominant buyer was the Sinaloa cartel, that up until a decade ago was basically the main buyer, the main external buyer in the country. So this presence of two sort of hegemonic actors or dealing in an orderly way with this traffic somehow contributed to keep the situation under control. Then you had the presidency of Korea that even engaged and fostered a sort of a legalization process with some of the gangs that were operating in the country, absorbing, including hiring some of the leaders within the state in exchange for sort of keeping peace in the streets. So the country experienced an incredible decrease in levels of violence, up to basically making it one of the most peaceful countries in the hemisphere just a decade ago, but also shut down the US military base in Manta. So starting to hinder the ability of state authorities to track, monitor, and tackle drug trafficking operations. And then the government of Lenin Moreno came, and in political infightings between the two, led Moreno to eventually, replace people put by Korea with people loyal to him, to shut down the Justice Ministry and an anti-corruption unit, to reduce budget for the prison system, also because, of course, Ecuador was also experiencing a very complicated financial situation. And all of these contributed to politicize the institution, all the while weakening their abilities to deal with organized crime. And then I'd say the endogenous factors came in. You have the peace accord in Colombia of 2016, which basically creates a vacuum in the Ecuador-Colombia border, filled then by some dissident factions which did not agree to the peace deal, and other criminal groups competing for territory in that area. You have the penetration of another Mexican actor, which is the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the competitor of the Sinaloa cartel, engaging in sort of proxy disputes with the Sinaloa cartel. And then you have the impact of the pandemic, which was crucial because on one hand, of course, it affected livelihoods of millions of people, including youngsters in marginalized communities without access to education or to job opportunities. So created an increase in the needs for many people. But also, since airports were closed, land borders were closed, were shut down for much time, for a lot of time during the pandemic, the maritime trafficking became primordial, became the predominant way of trafficking drugs. And of course, Ecuador offered great ports, particularly that of Guayaquil, that increased all these, set of elements, increased the volumes and of traffics basically through Ecuador. And this inevitably led to you have weakening state institutions and increased interest in the country by a multiplicity of actors, more unstable than political balance to deal with this, that inevitably led to tensions between some of the groups that were first collaborating, so Los Choneros in particular, which used to basically subcontract and or collaborate with other minor groups like Los Lobos, Los Figuerones, Los Chonekillers, etc. And you had the inevitably tensions to take the lead, not to get a better and greater slice of the cake, basically. This translated into
interrupt just for a moment,
yeah,
because when you speak of that, because it does sound as if there has been a breakdown in civil society in Ecuador. And you're right, in terms of Ecuador, obviously, is not the only place where they have this problem. But what is the president looking to do, President Noboa, who has made this statement that they're in a state of war? Um, what is he looking to do to try to get his country back on course? I mean, if you look at El Salvador and the president there, Bukele, who has essentially gotten control of that, although many people say that civil liberties have severely suffered as a result of that. So is President Noboa willing to do the same thing to get a grasp on restoring his country back to a semblance of order?
Well, that's a great problem because I think the comparison is hard to make between the two countries, not so much in terms of willingness to deal with this in a different manner, but capacity and sufficient political power to do so. As I was saying, I mean this initiated in 2018 some targeted killings in the prison system, and then after one of the leaders, well, the maximum leader of Los Llaneros was killed in late 2020, it basically triggered a wave of massacres in prisons that spilled over throughout the country in the streets. But the penetration of these interests that started back, as I said, decades ago, and then was increased during the presidency of Correa, make it very hard for Noboa to unilaterally, from the executive, being able to tackle this problem. Because as recent case called Metastasis showed, the penetration of this criminal interest to the higher echelons of the state, in the judiciary, in the security forces, even with politicians, as was proven by these massive levels that actually reported of political violence during the 2023 local and presidential elections, display that the penetration is such that a unilateral move by the executive is hardly going to solve the problem, particularly because there's no control over the prison system. And that's the starting point from where Bukele was able to sort of try and remove people from the streets without turning the prisons, or without turning the prison again to be the epicenter of violence, also through the construction of a new mega jail, which Noboa is also planned to do, but it's proposed to plan to build two prisons of like a few hundred prisoners capacity, not 40,000, as in El Salvador. So of course there's a
want to
need.
come back to that for a moment, but I want to go to Sandra to talk a little bit about also what's going on in Haiti. Haiti, obviously, it seems as though civil society has collapsed there. The drug gangs seem to have reports of up to 80% control of Port-au-Prince, and they seem to be running wild around there. Now, since the assassination of the last president, things have gotten worse. There are a lot of calls for a resignation of the present interim president, President Henry. Um, what's going on in Haiti? I mean, Haiti has always been a place where instability has kind of been more of a way of life. But what is happening now? What's the cause of what's going on in Haiti?
Thank you for that questions. Yeah, exactly as you just said, Haiti is a country that has faced a sustained period of crisis, which has led to the security situations and the extreme levels of violence that we observe today. The violence that ACLED observe is mostly driven by gangs, which in recent years have grown deadlier as a result of heightened competitions between rival gangs and their expansions to new areas within the Port-au-Prince metropolitan area, but also beyond in other regions. But I think in the case of Haiti, it's important to emphasize that gang activity and its violent manifestation is not a new phenomenon in the history of the countries. Politicians have long relied on armed groups and militia to secure their positions of power. So I'm thinking, for instance, of François Duvalier and de Tonton Macoute, or even later President Aristide and his reliance on the so-called Chimère paramilitary groups. So as a result of politicians continuously instrumentalizing armed groups as part of political competitions over decades, gangs have remained an active presence in Haiti's political landscapes until today. But what we observe today, and you mentioned it, are unprecedented levels of violence, which has stemmed from their activity. And this is a phenomenon that has been on the rise since ACLED began coverage of the country in 2018. I think the rise of violence and overall worsening of the country's security situations remained directly tied to the political instability that Haiti has faced as a nation. So what we see, for instance, in ACLED dataset is that spikes in deadly violence tends to coincide with periods of unrest, which are manifested in our dataset in demonstrations. So that's something we observed as early as 2018 and 2019, notably with the Petrocaribe scandals. Back then, gangs have perpetrated several massacres I'm thinking of La Saline in November 2018 or in Bel Air a year later. And reports have demonstrated that these were attempts by political elites through gangs to crack down on anti-government strongholds that were participating in the demonstrations. Now, while violence has consistently increased since 2018, it is true that deadly violence has skyrocketed since the killing of Jovenel Moïse in July 2021. And that is because his assassination led to the fragmentations of the political landscape. We've seen notably that there has been a power struggle right after the assassinations of Moïse, which in turn has affected the systems of alliance and sponsorship that existed between gangs and politicians, and that previously allowed gangs to maintain their operations. This had the consequences to push gangs to grow more independent and look for alternative streams of revenues. And this is why we've seen an increase in kidnappings for ransoms. We've also seen gangs developing extortion markets, seizing key infrastructures and facilities. So for instance, the seizures of the Vareux oil terminal by the G9 gang or the controls of the main road axis. This has obviously had terrible consequences first of all, this has led to the intensifications of disputes between gangs over new sources of revenue in new territories, with terrible consequences of civilians that are often caught into the crossfires, either directly targeted by gangs as part of their disputes. We've seen increasing numbers of sexual violence used as a weapon as part of those conflicts. And this is pretty much the situations and the general background in which the rise in violence takes place in Haiti. Obviously, there are other factors that have contributing to the worsening of the security situation, which is weak governance, corruptions, also weak law enforcement institutions, judicial institutions. And perhaps to conclude, and one thing to add is that the weaknesses of institutions has led to high levels of impunity. Gangs have been able to operate pretty much unpunished. And one consequences of that has been a stark rise in vigilante violence, which we've seen especially last year, notably with the emergence of the Bois Calais movement, which essentially consists of citizens taking justice into their own hand and targeting suspected gang members, which adds up to already high and extreme violence going on in the country.
Let me ask both of you, because both of you raise an important question, because a lot of people say this could not take place without implicit involvement by government officials. And in fact, I think both of you know that the United States had investigated, for example, the president of Mexico for having involvement with the drug trade that goes through Mexico, even though that's been dropped quietly. But it just seems as though you can't do this without having entrenched corruption. For example, the widow of President Moise had just been arrested for being implicated in his murder, along with a lot of other people who have been arrested in the United States as well as in Haiti. So the question is, if it's that entrenched in terms of corruption, how is it possible to get a hold on this? I know in Haiti they're thinking about sending troops there. Kenya has been looking to send troops. The United States wants troops to come through the United Nations. But with entrenched corruption, if that is indeed the case, how is it possible to stem back the tide of violence that's going through these countries? Let me start with Sandra, then and go to Tiziano.
Yes, it is true that corruptions and deep ties between the political and economic elite with those groups is one of the major challenge and lingering questions as to what will happen in the advance of the deployments of the Kenya-led and UN-backed international force. So what it is crucial to definitely address the security situation through, and as the mission is planning to do, to the strengthening of police forces, which are overpowered and outgunned. Any intervention is, or the results of an international intervention will not have long-lasting peace if we don't address corruptions issues and weak institutions. So it is essential to sever, first of all, ties between politicians and gangs. And we've seen that a couple of international of countries have made effort in that directions. The US issued sanctions against politicians that had demonstration ties with gangs. That also had the other pervert effect of having gangs increasingly growing independent, as they seem that their former political sponsors is trying to keep a low profile as part of the sanctions. But it is essential to accompany any interventions, any security response with reforms to the judicial systems, strengthening, first of all, the judicial system to make sure that to end impunity. What will happen if we start arresting thousands of gang members, but we're not able to process them in judicial institutions? There's also reforms that are required within the prison system, which are currently overcrowded and inadept to receive any streams of potential detainees. Yeah, overall, corruptions remains an issue, and any security response is bound to have limited effects in the long run if we don't address those pre-existing ties.
Let me go over to you. Really, pretty much the same question. We all know of the allegations of corruption in various nations. How do you see that playing out in a place like Ecuador and also surrounding countries? We talked about President Bukele and what he's tried to do, but is Ecuador in a place politically where they can stem the tide of violence that's presently in their country?
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I agree with what Sandra said. I think I would stress the importance of regaining control of the prison system, which is, I think, the precondition to sort of regain some order and try to tackle more effectively the penetration of these criminal interests. The question is, how do you do that in a manner that is democratic, that is respectful of human rights and due process? Because we've seen, you mentioned him a couple of times already, Bukele has been able to stem gang violence in El Salvador by jailing 2% of the country's population. Now, in a country which is as tiny as El Salvador, it's already a lot, but how can you do that in Mexico or in Colombia, in Ecuador? And of course, several thousands, already 7,000 have been released by the government, reckoning that they were unjustly detained, and human rights organizations claim that this number is very much higher. Although, of course, I'm sure that the majority of the people that have been detained, and from conversation that I had, first-hand experience, they were related to gang. And that's actually how it's translated into, dismantling most of gang operations throughout the country. But how can you do that, without these massive disruptions of lives of the tens of thousands of people? That's the big question. There's an option. I mean, Guatemala back in 2007 installed a UN-backed commission against impunity, which precisely meant to not only fight corruption in the broader sense within the state, but actually tried to dismantle what were called SIACs. So groups that operated in the illicit realm, but with ties to political, business, and military sectors. And it was able, over a period of 10 years, to dismantle over 70 of these groups. And this contributed, for sure, to Guatemala actually lowering the levels of violence in a faster pace compared to its neighbors. Now, that means that you need, in many cases, you may need some external help or UN or regional assistance, because possibly it's hard to purge, to clean up the state, and it's definitely impossible to do it from the executive if, as in the case of Noboa in Ecuador, you don't have even a majority in Congress, you don't have a control over the judiciary, which Bukele has, but which of course comes with great costs for democracy in the country in the medium and long run.
One of the issues here, obviously, is the presence of the United States, who is concerned for various reasons. With Haiti, it comes down to immigration and migrants coming in. Ecuador, obviously, the United States wants a stable Latin America for various political reasons. What can nations like the United States do to help these countries get back on track? Now, having said that, we are all aware of the United States and the fact that it is consistently, let's say in the case of Haiti, always backed the wrong dog in the race. That's been even with Moise. The Trump administration was warned that he was not the right person. The Biden administration was warned as well. Both administrations more or less ignored that advice and propped him up anyway. But having said that, what can the United States do, since they do have a vested self-interest in both countries, to help stem the tide of violence and to return these countries to some semblance of a civil society?
May I throw in a couple of ideas?
Yeah, Tiziana, let me start with you, and then let me go to Sandra.
Thanks. I think there are two realms in which certainly, well, foreign partners of Latin American countries, have somehow vested interest and can also provide some support. We've talked extensively about the deficiencies in the judiciary, in the prison system, and also we forgot to talk about the overall the ports, the main epicenter of infrastructure through which most of these illicit traffics occur. I was reading a news back in 2023 that in Ecuador you have like 3,500 containers passing through the Guayaquil port and no scanners functioning, and police relying on sniffing dogs that could inspect 3 containers a day. So of course, in terms of technical equipment, I think there's certainly areas in which external partners can offer support. Of course, the resources are always needed for any government in Latin America to support their plans. And in terms of training, I think there's huge preparation in both Europe and the US on how to improve investigation techniques and other issues. I do also think, though, there are a couple of issues that the US on one hand and Europe on the other can also do, by looking at what's happening, in those contexts. So besides what's happening in Latin America, and those relate to, first of all, the ease with which, for example, firearms are purchased and can be smuggled from the US. There's a lot of investigation so far by now that proves that around 60 to 70%, depending on the countries, of firearms used in and seized basically by the police to criminal organizations are US manufactured. So that's certainly an area that I think could be, could be looked at in the US. And at the same time, there's a growing consumption problem, for example, of cocaine, but also synthetic drugs in Europe and in Asia. That's also, for example, seizures of cocaine have tripled over the past 5 years in Europe's ports. So also on this side of the Atlantic, I think there's a lot to do in terms of like dealing with consumption and stemming the inflow of these sort of illicit businesses. I don't know if Sandra has to add anything.
Sandra, what would be your advice for U.S. officials in terms of what they can do to help Haiti? Again, given the comments in terms of United States has not always been an effective partner for Haiti. In fact, a lot of people blame the United States for the instability that is in Haiti. But reality is what it is, and the United States is the power in this region. So, what can the United States do to alleviate this problem?
Perhaps, well, the United States and overall the international community will definitely need to address the number of weaknesses in governance that have fueled violence in the country. So first of all, and this is something I mentioned earlier, the fact that police has been overpowered and outgunned needs to be addressed somehow through building their capacity. Is in Ecuador, this is something that we see very clearly. So we see, for instance, that in recent years, the numbers of clashes between gangs and state forces have increased, which might be indicative of indeed increased effort by Asian law enforcement to tackle gangs. But this trend also reveals that police forces have also increasingly being targeted by gangs themselves, either police officers or police stations. We have a lot of examples fresh from this year with the taking over of the women civil prison in Cabaret by the Canaan gang, or even more recently this month, gang taking over police stations in the Centre region. So obviously there is an excruciating need for police forces to have their capacity and their equipment enhanced. But while building their capacity is crucial, we should also not overlook that there are ongoing suspicions and reports of collusions between gangs and police officers, which is an issue that must be tackled to make sure that any international assistance does not end up putting more resources in the hand of the wrong people, right? Similarly, and going back to the point I was making earlier, it is important to continue efforts to sever ties between gangs and political elites. So far, there's been effort with sanctions, but there should definitely be support in enhancing Haiti's judicial institutions as well as penitentiary systems, similar to what's going on in Ecuador. Another driving factors that we must be looking at in order to curb gang violence is armed proliferations and trafficking, which has exacerbated rivalries between gangs in Haiti and has also allowed them to strengthen. Drug trafficking flow is also an issue and something that gangs have been relying on as an additional source of revenue. So it's also definitely important to address these trafficking issues in order to weaken gangs. But again, and that comes back to my first point, Haiti's security situation crisis is closely tied to the political situations. So it remains important to continue to support a way out of Haiti's political crisis. There's currently no elected officials in office since January last year, if I'm not mistaken, after the mandate of the senators expired. The successive government, including acting Prime Minister Ariel Henry, has been unable to organize elections. And so far, the interim government has been unable to find an agreement with the oppositions on the organizations of elections, which has also led more recently to the escalations of violence with the return of rebel leader Guy Philippe and calls for resignations of acting prime minister. So any support, any long-lasting reforms to deal with weak governance is also tied to finding a way out of Haiti's political crisis. There has been support from the international community with the CARICOM forum, for instance, which did not lead to any agreements, but I think it remains essential that we support Asian authority in finding a way out of this crisis and ensure that there is an elected and legitimate officials in office that is able to undertake the reforms that are necessary to reduce violence. And I think it is also important to mention, and perhaps that's something for a later stage, once gang violence has indeed been reduced, but we should not forget that civilians are the one bearing the brunt of the violence. At all of the forms of violent interactions we record in Haiti, the targeting of civilians is by far the highest. Civilians in some marginalized neighborhoods of Port-au-Prince are the ones that are exposed daily to extreme forms of violence, sexual violence, extortions, and else, with often no access to medical help and psychological supports. And I think that's definitely an area that will need increased attentions in the coming years to help civilians tackle the severe trauma that they have experienced as the result of gang violence.
Let me ask both of you. One of and I want to stay with the United States for a moment. One of the complaints about the U.S. in terms of its policies towards many countries is it always does it from the paradigm of military. It's always militaristic. And I was speaking to someone from the Wilson Center who said the United States needs to get away from a military paradigm as it deals with nations all the time. As one of the questions was brought up, should the United States look to embark, along with its European partners, along something along the lines of the Marshall Plan that was done after World War II, to begin to rebuild the civil society, but also just to provide economic opportunity in a place like Haiti, but also perhaps in a place like Latin America, which, quite frankly, is looking to hedge its bets against the United States by aligning itself, as Tiziana, as you well know, people like Lula, who's going to, build relationships with China, making sure he maintains some semblance of relationships with Russia. But should the United States be looking at a more economic strategy rather than a militaristic one, even though in the short run that may be what is needed? Sandra, let me start with you on that question. I mean, what's your opinion on that?
I think it's an interesting position. I don't have the answer on that, but certainly economic support, is much needed in Haiti. Haiti is a country that has, suffered high levels of poverty, inequalities, and this has been an ongoing issues, and also something that has contributed, for instance, to the recruitment of youngsters into gangs. So that's definitely something to be looking at. However, considering ongoing corruption levels in the countries, I'm also concerned that any economic or massive economic plans in Haiti could also turn out being having funds diverted from what they were originally intended. I mean, the Petrocaribe scandals from 2019 is actually a good example of that. So, subventions, subvention money has actually been derailed. So I would definitely be cautious on economic situations if it doesn't come hand in hand with the reforms that I mentioned earlier, making sure that corruption is addressed, strengthening Haiti's state institutions, and also, first of all, finding a way out of the crisis and organizing elections, which remains a priority. Haiti at the moment is in a conundrum in the sense that high levels of insecurity does not allow the holding of elections. At the same time, the holding of elections, the elections of a government legitimately elected, is also essential to start implementing potential solutions from a government level. That will be that.
Yeah, what's your reaction to that in terms of the United States as well as its Western partners because I think, as you had mentioned before, the reality is cocaine use has decreased in the United States, but it has increased in Europe. So Europe has some responsibility as well. And a lot of the drug trade is now going through Asia. So part of that is because there is, economic malaise in parts of Latin America. So should there be a Marshall Plan strategy, not exactly like it was in Europe, but a strategy that maybe helps some of these nations get out of this predicament?
Well, there's certainly, well, I think one point that even myself, I think in this conversation, I haven't stressed enough, and Sandra has mentioned it, is to not look at the region only from the drug perspective, and not looking at these organizations that operate in the region of just from, the sort of the bad guys dealing with drugs vis-a-vis good guys, in the security forces or elsewhere. These groups have diversified enormously their criminal portfolio. Extortion is a great problem that affects a growing number of people throughout the continent. Um, Illegal mining is a sector that is gaining a lot of, traction in the illicit economies. So there needs to be a holistic understanding on, how not only these type of violence is triggered and fueled by consumption of cocaine or other synthetic drugs in the US or Europe, but also, for example, by insufficiently monitored markets of gold, of copper, of any other raw materials that can be of interest for moving the economies of the world. Um, and secondly, the need, I think, and then this comes from also some of the years spent in Central America. I think it would be great if, in general, the experiences from the real local level would have more attention in terms of what could be a local-led solution to certain problems. Many times, beyond the fact that the militarized approach, gets the spotlight and then most of the resources, but also in the aid agencies like USAID or European aid agencies that fund projects at the local level, they don't always heed to what are the needs actually, or the ways of doing things in local communities, but rather like impose a sort of theoretical models of violence prevention that have been studied in European or US universities. So I think greater attention to local experiences and local solutions is certainly needed. And then, as you said, of course, there's a geopolitical shift in the world, and Latin America is, of course, part of it. And unless there's a greater attention in developing commercial ties to the region, it's a logical choice for many countries to deepen ties, particularly with China, with Russia a bit less, and that's only concerning Brazil and well, of course, Nicaragua and Venezuela for other political reasons, and maybe tiny bit in Mexico. But of course, China is going to offer trade opportunities for these countries, and so instead of just complaining about these shifts and this interest in deepening ties with Asia and China in particular, I think all the Western countries could have an opportunity to rather, double down on providing opportunities to people in these countries, because actually one of the main root causes of why so many youngsters, and we've seen it in Ecuador, where people as young as 14, as 13 get involved in gangs, not only because these are lucrative businesses and and they want to make money, but because they lack alternatives. They don't have access to basic education, to healthcare services. they're stigmatized by businesses and companies who don't hire for certain communities because they feel they may be hiring people belonging to gangs. And therefore that I think is the key to in the medium to long run impose a different approach to the region, probably improve its security situation.
My guests today have been Sandra Pellegrini and Tiziano Breda from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. And I want to thank both of you for being with me here today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Tony. It's a pleasure.
And join us again next week as we discuss another issue of international importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.